Okay, hello there, Year 7. Today we're going to be looking at how to vary your sentences in your writing, particularly your descriptive writing, to make it more interesting. And we're going to focus a little bit today on complex sentences, as well as reviewing simple sentences and compound sentences. Because as you all know, because you hear me talk about it all the time, if you vary your sentences, it makes me a very happy English teacher. There's my big ears, you see. Okay? And if you don't vary your sentences for effect, in other words, if you just use simple sentences all the time, then it's going to make it very difficult for you to get into those level 5s, which is where I would like you all to be. Okay, so let's start off with the basics. Okay, so let's start at the beginning, a very good place to start. There's 3 types of sentences we can use in our writing. We can use simple sentences, compound sentences, or complex sentences. Now, a simple sentence is a sentence that contains a main clause that stands alone. So, for example, Mr. Rhasides enjoys golf, or Mr. Rhasides very much enjoys playing golf. That is an example of a simple sentence. Just one main clause followed by a full stop, and there you go. Now, a compound sentence links 2 main clauses together by a conjunction or by using a semicolon. So before we go any further, I just want you to stop the video and on your sheet of paper I'd like you to write down as many conjunctions as you can think of. So in other words, what are the words we can use to link 2 main clauses or 2 simple sentences together? So pause the video now. Okay, now, hopefully, the words that you should have come up with are words like this. And, but, because, or. Now, there's many, many more, but these are the words that we use to link 2 independent clauses together. So, just before we go into complex sentences, let's see if you've got it. You've got 2 sentences here. The first one, the little boy and the little girl played together. And the second one, the little boy played in the sand and the little girl splashed around in the water. Now, you'll have noticed that Mr. Rhasides has made a slight mistake here because it should say the little girl. So my apologies for that. Happy face. Okay. Pause the video and tell and have a think about which one is a simple sentence and why, and which one is a compound sentence and why. Don't guess, be absolutely sure. Okay, so hopefully you would have figured out that the first one is our simple sentence. Because even though we've got our coordinating conjunction and in there, the little boy on its own is not a sentence. And the little girl played together makes no sense. So all that's going on here is that we've got one main clause. The little boy and the little girl played together. Now that differs to our second sentence, which I hope you'd have guessed is our compound sentence. Now, the reason it's our compound sentence is you can spot the 2 main clauses. The little boy played in the sand is a main clause because it can stand on its own, and the little girl splashed around in the water is also a main clause. And they are linked together by your conjunction and. Okay, so this is your first little activity for homework. I'd now like you to write down 5 compound sentences for me and try to use a different conjunction in each one. And just in case you haven't quite got it yet, I've done you another example down here. Mr. Rhasides is a lovely man because he doesn't set us that much homework. Now, this is your conjunction. And you'll notice that Mr. Rhasides is a lovely man, stands on its own, therefore it's a main clause. He doesn't set us that much homework, could also be a main clause. So that is an example of a compound sentence. So 5 of your own now, folks. Okay, so that leads us on to the most tricky one, which is a complex sentence. And this contains an independent clause plus one or more dependent clauses. Now, you'll have heard me talk about dependent clauses before. The other word for them is subordinate clauses. Now, that's the part of the sentence that cannot stand on its own. It needs the main clause to make it make sense. And because it can't stand on its own, we must always make sure we use a comma to separate the main clause from the subordinate clause. Okay, so here's an example for you, Year 7. It was a cold and windy night, unlike any other he had ever experienced. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to underline the main clause in that sentence. So what is the bit that makes sense? What is the bit that we could put a full stop after? So go ahead and write out the sentence and then underline the main clause. Okay, so hopefully you established it was a cold and windy night is your main clause, because that makes sense on its own. Unlike any other he had ever experienced, that is your subordinate clause, because that does not make sense on its own. So if you started a sentence like that, unlike any other he had experienced, and then put a full stop at the end, I'd be underlining your work and saying no, 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 because that is an incomplete sentence. Okay, so what do? We put a comma to separate out the main clause from the subordinate clause. Now, the tricky thing about complex sentences is that the subordinate clause can go at the start, the middle, or the end of the sentence. It doesn't matter. What I've got for you here is a couple of sentences, and again I'd like you to pause the video and have a think about where the subordinate clauses go. Where are the subordinate clauses in these two sentences? Now think about the comma, that gives you a bit of a hint. Think about whether it can stand on its own. If the part of the sentence can stand on its own, then it's the main clause. If it can't, if it doesn't make sense on its own, then it's a subordinate clause. So pause the video and have a little go at that. Now, I'm sure you're an expert at this now, but just to double check, despite his initial reluctance, Mr. Rhasides began to embrace 21st century technology. Mr. Rhasides began to embrace 21st century technology makes sense on its own. So you should have identified that as the main clause. Despite his initial reluctance, gives more information to the rest of the sentence, but it can't stand on its own. It's a subordinate clause. And once again, you'll notice that our little friend, the comma, is there to separate off the two. Now, this is an example of a subordinate clause that goes at the start of a sentence. Now, for the second sentence, you should have noticed that the subordinate clause is actually in the middle this time, because it's separated off by two commas. The beautiful woman, despite the man's best efforts, refused to give in to flattery. Now, despite the man's best efforts is your subordinate clause, because it does not make sense on its own. The beautiful woman refused to give in to flattery does make sense on its own. So sometimes you have to search on either side of the subordinate clause for the main clause. Now, as it was Super Bowl Sunday when I was making this PowerPoint, I decided to do a little bit of creative writing based around the Super Bowl. So here's my hero. Here's Tom Brady, who won it for the Patriots, as it turned out, on Sunday. There he is. And I've just done a little bit of descriptive writing just to give you an indication of the type of ways we can vary our sentences. So I'll just move Tom up there a little bit so he can watch over the work. Now, we're going to read this together. It was the calm before the storm. The anxious faces of the crowd peered over the vast expanse of green as the players prepared themselves for battle. It was Super Bowl Sunday. In a flash of animation and a white tide of light, the first quarter began. The noise from the crowd was deafening. The pitch had suddenly become an arena for gladiators. But beyond the noise and frantic, befuddled tackling and throwing, there was simply the joy of watching something truly special. So that's all very Englishy, and I've used a lot of big words, but you should also notice how much I've varied my sentences. So again, I'd like you to pause the video and have a think about where the simple sentences are, where the complex sentences are, and where the compound sentences are, because you should be able to find all three. So go ahead and pause the video. Okay, now let's go through this together. You should have noticed I've started off with a simple sentence. It was the calm before the storm. Just that main clause followed by a full stop. And I've thought very carefully about why I've used this. I want to build up this sense of excitement, this sense of building to something. And a short sentence is always a good way of doing that. But then I want to get a little bit more animated and a little bit more into my writing. So the anxious faces of the crowd peered over the vast expanse of green as the players prepared themselves for battle. Now you should have noticed that as the players prepared themselves for battle doesn't make sense on its own. So that is an example of the subordinate clause in a complex sentence. CS, complex sentence. Then we carry on. In a flash of animation and a white tide of light, the first quarter began. Again, that's another complex sentence, because in a flash of animation and a white tide of light does not make sense on its own. Okay. Then I've shifted back to a compound sentence here. The noise from the crowd, there should be crowd in there again, sorry, was deafening. The pitch had suddenly become an arena for gladiators. Now you'll notice that instead of using and, but, or because, I've used a semicolon there to link my two main clauses. So the noise from the crowd was deafening. The pitch had suddenly become an arena for gladiators. Both make sense on their own, but I've linked them with that conjunction, and I've created a nice compound sentence. So you get the idea. But beyond the noise and frantic, befuddled tackling and throwing, there was simply the joy of watching something truly special. So once again, I've ended with a slightly more complex sentence, if you will. Okay, so as your final activity, I'd like you to have a go at writing your own short paragraph, varying your sentences for effect. Now remember all the things we've talked about today. You can use simple sentences, that's great. You can use compound sentences, that's great. You can use complex sentences, that's great. But if you overuse any one of them, your writing is going to be really boring, and it's not going to be sort of exciting like my little Super Bowl example down here. So, pick whatever topic you want. It can be a sporting event that you've been to. It can be a particularly memorable moment, a moment that made you scared, happy, sad. It doesn't matter. But write your own short paragraph, varying your sentences for effect. And that is what I'm going to be really looking at when I mark your homework, when you hand it in next week. So thank you very much for listening. Hope this was useful. And stay tuned for your next homework assignment.